Hello and welcome to the Arise interview. 60 minutes of big questions about the big stories from the news and beyond with fresh insight and critical analysis. I'm Charles Anyagulu. Coming up in the next hour, as Nigeria, Africa and the world face a major global health crisis with death rates rising, health facilities overwhelmed, millions of people out of work and billions under lockdown, world leaders, governments, the private sector and NGOs are coming together as never before to fight this withering pandemic. Among them, a coalition of civil society organizations in Nigeria trying to counter the spread of misinformation, which has become a big issue in our tech-connected world. We'll speak with one of the leading voices of that coalition, Professor Pat Utomi, in a moment. Now, in a world taken over by whispers, gossip and fake news, it's crucially important to separate facts from fiction in order to lessen the fear and help millions come to terms with the coronavirus pandemic. We've heard everything from COVID-19 can be cured by ingesting cleaning products used in fish tanks, to coronavirus has been developed in a laboratory in China, the US or France. And it isn't just coming from ordinary people. Social media platforms have recently taken down multiple videos made by the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, accusing him of spreading fake news. Mr. Bolsonaro has been encouraging Brazilians to ignore the stay-at-home precautions. He's posted videos of himself walking through a crowd of market vendors and has demanded the removal of quarantines and a return to normality. Well, Twitter, Facebook and Instagram have taken down and barred such videos. It's to try to resist such misinformation and to fight it that a powerful coalition of civil society groups has come together in Nigeria. Their spokesperson is the eminent academic and former presidential advisor, Dr. Pat Utomi. We'll speak to him in a moment, but first, here he is setting out their stall in this video. Well, we'll try and return to that clip later on. There doesn't appear to be any audio on it, although we listened to it earlier and it appeared to be there. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now from our Lagos studios by the man you saw in that video but didn't hear, sadly, Professor Pat Utomi, who, in addition to being a spokesperson for the Civil Society Coalition Against COVID-19 Misinformation, is also an academic, former presidential advisor, businessman, anti-corruption champion, and founder of several civil society organizations on accountability and good governance. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Can you hear me there?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly, and it's a pleasure to be able to join you.
Well, I'm glad that you can, because your video, I was watching it earlier, where you were talking about the need to put out correct information. We're going to hear a clip of it, but we will hear it later in the program. But let me just first of all start by welcoming you to the program and to ask you whether you think there's a lot of drama and tension and worry and speculation about what is happening with COVID-19 and the way the media, traditional media, as well as social media, is covering it.
Well, I think that clearly we're dealing with a very frightening phenomenon, and there ought to be concern. People are puzzled because they have not experienced anything like this before. We have had some epidemics, but one point that is made is that COVID-19 combines both the anger, if you will, of an Ebola and the efficiency of the influenza of 100 years or so ago, 1918. So when you have something as frightening as this that people don't have any experience with, they live in a time of grave uncertainty. Where there's uncertainty, people resort to all kinds. And this is why we have had the kind of thing that we have. And again, besides SARS, Ebola, this is really the first, major epidemic or now pandemic that is taking place in a time of social media. So that adds a new perspective, a new dimension to what we are dealing with. So I'm not surprised that we have all of this, but it is important that people step forward and order people's, if you will, anxieties towards what is important. What we have seen in the grave misinformation is that you have a group of people, for example, who are science doubters, who don't believe the science, who say, your earlier report talked about the president of Brazil. In some ways, the president of the United States of America is a kind of science doubter, but this has brought him to some different place, I suspect. It has showed him that his power is not as much as he thought in the face of this kind of virus. But even more frightening in our context, given the fact that most of the early affected, besides the index case that came from Italy, are politicians. There are many people in Nigeria who say, this is a rich man's disease. It will not get to us. It is supposed to get to those thieves who have stolen all our money. So God is just using it to punish them. Now, okay, I'm not sure what God's plan is right here, but what is important is that this is as dangerous as it can be, and that it's a very opportunistic virus, and once there is human contact, the possibility that it can jump from one to the other is extremely high. If you look at the numbers of how it spread in China, in Wuhan, you will see that one person contacting from another person could lead in a matter of a couple of days to 3,000 people being infected. So we must realize how lethal as, a weapon this is, that we really, really maintain the social distance. How do we deal with this rash of misinformation? My thesis is that we should be just as efficient as that virus in spreading the correct information. I think that we need credible people talking to people within their spheres of influence. People don't always believe government, especially in a society where politics has been mainly plunder. So let's get people, talk to people that they know and tell them. Our strategy is to get everybody to get 10 people every day that they can influence and give them the correct information. The podcast that I put out last week was designed to help provide some of that kind of correct information. And I also put out some write-up from the Center for Values in Leadership, which could then be used to appropriately sensitize people who can then begin to, in a kind of pyramid scheme, running all the way down to the bottom of the pyramid, get many more people to know the truth of what we're dealing with and how to deal with it. So in the course of our engagement, yesterday, for example, we had a video conference of a number of leading civil society people and private sector people, in which we kind of try to identify some key points. I am expecting that during the course of our conversation we'll get to them, but we have now a 12-point agenda of things that must be done so that this thing does not take us by surprise again. Even though it shouldn't have, it gave us plenty of notice, but very typically Nigerian, we somehow believed that it was not going to come to us, so we waited until it suddenly was with us.
Okay,
we must not only deal with all the major issues on ground now.
I'm going to come in there briefly because obviously we're going to try and make this a chat. The points you're making, very well taken, but we're going to be taking a break in about a minute and 30 seconds or so. But I just want to ask you, before we take that break, do you think that this sort of pointed coverage, media coverage that we're seeing, getting all that information in real time to audiences, does that give them better control of the situation, or is it the exact opposite? Are we over-covering the story?
I think it is helpful, but I think that we exaggerate the reach of media sometimes. You know, it reminds me of the challenge to media impact, effectiveness in media and society research. The assumption, say in the early part of the last century, that once a powerful newspaper like the New York Times endorses a candidate, he should win an election, and he ends up not winning, and so people are shocked, what happened? And you realize that not many people get their information directly from the media. I can give you an example. A friend of mine was on one of the television networks a couple of days ago on this subject, and he was trying to find out how many people got what he said. He was shocked to his bones that many of his friends that he asked didn't even watch the show, didn't hear anybody talk about the show. So, given the fact that most communication is a multi-step flow, that the person who may listen to that will influence somebody, communicate what he heard to another person, and may add salt and pepper to what he or she heard before it gets to the third person. It is important to think communication more thoroughly than whether saturation media coverage is taking place.
I'm going to just leap in there, Professor Utomi. Just stay with us because we'll come right back to you. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Professor Pat Utomi, who's in our Lagos studio. Stay with us.
Come to you on a very, very serious subject matter, a matter of life and death for all of us, in fact, for the civilization.
Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Inigul. Now he's an academic, former presidential advisor, businessman, anti-corruption champion, and founder of several civil society organizations on accountability and good governance. Dr. Pat Utomi is also a former presidential candidate and former Delta State governorship aspirant on the platform of the ruling APC party. But now he and his coalition of civil society organizations have turned their sights on misinformation in the time of the coronavirus threat. And there are lots of fake news stories about, including that both Ronaldo, the footballer, and the Pope have been infected, and that the virus came from a failed biological experiment. But even more worrying are the fake news reports that COVID-19 has a cure. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, here's another clip from Professor Utomi's video talking about the virus and what it's all about.
So let us begin by understanding what this virus is and how the effort to curb it should be going. First of all, this virus moves very easily from one human to another. It's an incredibly infectious disease. But how does it move? Well, it can go from one person who is infected, who has either coughed or some projection from inside of him, has hit a surface. Could be that you shook hands with the person after he or she has sneezed and the virus is on their palm, or the person has touched the surface, whether it's a table or a car or anywhere, and you then touch that. And as we do as human beings all the time, unconsciously touch our face. It then enters through our nose, our mouth, or our eyes, and gets lodged in a problem area in our throat, and then gets to do damage to our respiratory capacity. It is not a matter of 20 people or 50 people. Just even one-on-one contact can keep the spread going. So what we need to do as much as possible is, one, ensure that we continue to wash our hands, clean our environment, keep them so sanitized that if it were to have dropped off somebody who is infected, we do not pick it up. And secondly, if we are to be with people, give ourselves at least 2 meters, such that were they to project and something were to come out of them, it would not get on us in a way that could lead to us being carriers. And 3 people in a taxi, or 4, as in one state, as I heard, it doesn't solve it.
you know, at best, it should be only one person in a car or one person and a driver. But as much as possible, when it gets to lockdown, let us make sure that social contacts are the minimum so it cannot go from one person to another. Because if it does not go from one person to another, the virus will die. You know, the virus does not just stay around, it will die if it doesn't get that opportunity of jumping from one person.
And with me from our studios in Lagos, Professor Pat Utomi, who, in addition to being a spokesperson for the Civil Society Coalition Against COVID-19 Misinformation, is also an academic, former presidential advisor, and an anti-corruption champion. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And thankfully, we got to your video there, and we actually heard what you were saying. Very informative, and I can see what you're trying to do, which is to use that medium and your coalition to try and get out as much correct information as possible. But we were talking before we went on break, Professor Utomi, about traditional media. Let's talk a little bit about social media, which is probably the main medium that you're going to use to communicate the information that you want to put out. I mean, how big is the threat of fake news during this time of immense concern and immense crisis? I mean, because surely common sense will usually prevail, won't it? I mean, or are people so tormented by fear that they'll hearken to anything, particularly any suggestion of a cure?
Yeah, I want to begin this from putting this in a moral context. You know, social media is very powerful, can be used for good, can be used for ill. But we're dealing with one of the most challenging cases of human solidarity or need for human solidarity. And that so much damage can come from the right thing not going forward. However, those who are inclined to abuse are inclined to abuse. We must ensure that collectively, with a good social conscience, we can contain those, because the damage they do is damage to all of us. I don't think I have the time on a program like this to illustrate this point, but one of the suggestions I like to make for me as an academic is to read. It's an interesting book by a Harvard professor titled Moral Tribes. And I think I probably talked to that book the last time I was with you. And the point that he comes clearly to me is that in the end you find that what science is proving to us is that these values, these issues of human solidarity, is beyond just a matter of faith, religion, but really a matter of human survival. How do human beings define self-interest? There's a collective interest here that surpasses self-interest. And I think that if there's anything that I take away from Joshua Green, it is the point that we can persuade people to realize that to misuse that medium at a time like this not just hurts other people or hurts their enemies, it ultimately hurts themselves, they themselves, as we say in Nigeria. So this is really the point about my approach to how to engage with social media. If we took the strength of social media and said, we want to build a pyramid, not a Ponzi scheme, but a pyramid of communication that pushes accurate information down to the bottom of the pyramid. And everybody does their bit, starting from my formula of talk to 10 people you really have influence with, who trust you. Because central to communication is trust. And communicate the appropriate thing to them to know how their interest is best served. We will find that we will reach ultimately the, if you will, Ubuntu moment, the African sense of that the best self-interest is advanced in the advance of the common good of all. I am because we are.
Right.
This is a time for that to play out.
Okay, well, I mean, Professor Utomi, one of the things you called for in that video was for the government to disseminate and coordinate information so everyone knows what they ought to do. Are you satisfied that that is being done?
You know, we're challenged in the way government is organized. There's a small irony in this whole conversation because I'm in the middle of writing a book that basically says democracy is not working around the world, was still in our country. And I'm trying to propose other forms of organizing government. And when this whole thing started, I had just entered into the chapter on competition and how we translate it. And what I find is that there's no capacity in government in Nigeria for a variety of reasons. The French writer Frederick Bastiat talks about legal plunder, the pursuit of public life as opportunity for plunder. I think that in the context of our challenged democracy, there's such an absorbing desire for plunder that focus on the purpose of government is limited. I mean, there's no reason why we could not have organized so much better with the 3 months advance notice we had on this. But this is not the time to talk about those things because, you know, it will be a distraction. The thing is to focus on what we can do to get over this moment because there are many critical, and we have the next pandemic coming. It's going to come. 4 years ago, Bill Gates, in a widely circulated TED talk, made the point that this is the biggest threat, bigger than nuclear warfare that's facing humanity. And we prepared for it. He was talking with the background of Ebola. And suddenly it's with us. There will be another one soon. How are we taking advantage of learning from this to prepare for the next one? This is part of the critical. And how do we bring in private interventions? I was just talking with Fola Diola before I came on this show. Now, Fola, who's a businessman, former banker, has gone out of his way to create a fund. They have built and are making available in a number of locations, including Ogun State and I believe Lagos, facilities, ventilators. I think that when individuals like those set out with their experience and strength, contributing to the pool of effort that they are making might be a more efficient way to even get things done than waiting for government to do something. But again, we must develop options that we can turn to as we see the state becoming a weaker and weaker part of how we organize as a society.
I have to say, Professor Utomi, it is always fascinating listening to you talk and listening to your analysis of society. I mean, it makes me want to go back to university. But just before we take a break, just to looking at how things are actually taking place in Nigeria presently, I mean, a significant percentage of the country are in lockdown at the moment, in Abuja, in Lagos where you are, and in subsequently later this week in Ogun State, and I understand parts of Oyo State as well. And I've also just been told that I've got just a few seconds left, so I'll hold off my next question till we take this break and come back. But do stay with us, Dr. Utomi. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we talk some more with Professor Pat Utomi. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyekulu. Now, he's one of Nigeria's most notable and respected activists, Dr. Pat Utomi, an academic, an economist, an author, a governorship aspirant, and a presidential hopeful who's now turning his activism into a fight against fake news about the coronavirus. He's brought together a coalition of civil society organizations to work with him on this, and they've got their work cut out for them. For instance, in Nigeria and elsewhere, millions of people have heard about the supposed virtues of chloroquine, and many dangerous attempts at self-medication have been made. There have also been suggestions that tea, red meat, alcohol, and even cocaine all have curative properties that work against COVID-19. So Professor Pat Utomi and his team are working to be able to spot such fake news and at least try to prevent it from being shared widely. Here's a bit more of the prof on video giving the right information about what to do about the virus.
So what we need to do is to ensure that within a period of time that we prevent that opportunity from going from one person to another. This is the heart of the matter. Most critical is information about how it spreads. All of us need to be able to organize. What government needs to do is coordinate this information system that everybody really knows what is at stake and how they should behave during this season until the virus dies or stops being a threat to all of us. What are we using social media for? How can we create pyramids? You know, we do network marketing and all of that. Can we create pyramids of properly informing others so that the base all the way has the right information? Anytime you do anything, please wash your hands properly with soap. It's more effective than anything else. If you don't have soap and water immediately, yes, use a sanitizer, but as soon as you can, wash your hands. That's where you should be going. Soap, water, a good pill, and wash your hands. And try and stay as far away as possible from somebody. And if you were to feel any, discomfort, you're getting a headache, you're beginning to cough, a dry cough, immediately isolate yourself so that another person doesn't possibly get infected from you. You're doing that person good, you're doing yourself good, you're doing all of society good so that we can survive this. It is not a time for grandstanding, organizing committees, donating money. That's not what we need to be focusing on. We need to be focusing on information and communicating to people so that our practices become antisocial, unfortunately, for a season, so that we may have seasons where we can be more social. And thank you for being citizens. Thank you for saving your neighbor and saving yourself. Let's keep talking to one another and informing others so that this coronavirus will not get the better of us. On behalf of the Center for Values in Leadership and a coalition of media and civil society organizations deeply interested in your well-being, please stay safe.
And Professor Pat Utomi, academic, former presidential advisor and anti-corruption champion, and voice of the civil society coalition against COVID-19 misinformation, is still with me from our Lagos studios. And thank you for staying with us. And just to get your thoughts on the right way to deal with the lockdown, which is of course now in force in Abuja here, where I'm talking to you from, and in Lagos, where you are. I mean, there are reports that the Nigerian army is planning to deploy to enforce this coronavirus lockdown. Would you support such a deployment?
It's not a matter of force. In some places, obviously, people are challenged and you have to use authority to get things done, as you can see with the way the Chinese handled some of it. But it's about getting people to realize that this is in their best interest. But there are existential crises that many people deal with. I know that you may have seen this video from South Africa when this woman who really has to earn something every day to be able to eat says, look, let me take my chances. If I don't go out there and I stay at home, I die because I can't eat. If I go out there, I may die. So let me take my chances. Now, part of what our planning could have done is to help make that choice a little easier for that kind of person if it was a Nigerian context. And part of what the coalition that I'm working with is trying to do is how can we find corporates who can commit to bringing in essentials, whether food related, whether it's sanitization related, that can be dropped around in places where people who need and who can't survive unless they got something, live, organize it in a proper way. I mean, when I got a call, by the way, from the US, from a friend of mine, who said to me, your country is locking down with no organization, no plan for what to do to those who are locked down. And I had to be polite and nice about explaining it. But obviously it makes sense. And so you have to plan these things and execute. I mean, look at the business of shutting down borders. You know, this is the ultimate iatrogenic choice. You know, iatrogenic medicine is where the medicine that you apply does more damage to the patient than the disease they were suffering from. I mean, look at how people were on the Niger bridge, stranded. They were even threatening the bridge by just being locked down on the bridge with so much vehicular traffic just stranded on the bridge. The one in Port Harcourt. And you have so many people massed up in the name of protecting an area. Now that is the easiest way to spread the virus. Because if you hit any of those concentrations, we're done, you know? So I think that there is need in lockdown to apply some planning, to get people who have planned things to think through it. Part of what we are doing is make the civil society group available as a consultative platform. Bounce ideas of them. Governors who want to take a decision, bounce ideas of these civil society groups to get some feedback that might help you make a more optimal kind of choice, rather than just go with authority, go with force, and do more damage. And then here, we have to, again, turn to our police force, our public authorities. We have a shared humanity. Let us remember that all these people are human beings. Sorry to say, but in some places, law enforcement is extorting from the people in the name of implementing some of these measures.
Well, I mean, you do have a point, Professor Utomi. I mean, you certainly have a point there about the humanitarian side to things and the idea of planning, but obviously this took a lot of people unawares. I mean, although it was happening in China and so on and other places, but you may be right that perhaps the government should have planned a long time ago. They didn't. But I would wager that a lot of governments around the world didn't really plan for this. But just in terms of the particular issue you were mentioning, the police and so on, I mean, we've seen the police and some residents in Kenya clashing because they defied a curfew order saying they needed, you know, to work longer to be able to look after their families. I mean, most of them were earning a living as hawkers. I mean, how should Nigeria deal with workers like that who clearly have a point?
It's a major dilemma for poor countries particularly. I mean, look at the kind of money that India has budgeted to be able to provide in this kind of situation. Again, in some ways it gives me hope. Look, in 1991 I was studying India, and India was technically bankrupt. It had less than 3 weeks import money in its foreign reserves. But today, the Indian Prime Minister is able to make $37 billion available to support Indian citizens as they walk through this. It shows that with some seriousness in Nigeria, we can work ourselves out of where we are today. But the reality is that the state does not have the resources. But it needs to cut down dramatically. I mean, if I had my way, I would get rid of many state institutions, including the National Assembly, cut down on the executive waste everywhere, this protocol, these motorcades. People are suffering. We need to use those resources to support the Nigerian people, not make people feel that they are big men, which is what, unfortunately, the nature of the Nigerian state is. But seeing the clash, the tension between authority and the people in this kind of sense, what we need is a dialogue that will ensure that we achieve their interest, you know, which is to really get that lockdown, that social distance established, because in the end they will be dead anyway. But we have to do it in a way that make them realize that, sorry, it might be painful, it might be hurting now, but we need to do this. Look, Let me give a simple example. Pharmaceutical companies are trying to get supplies that are needed across the country. They don't know who to give them permission to drive through states that have locked them down and shut the borders. These are the kinds of things we should think through, have an authority that gets the pharmaceutical companies, gives them authorization, and all of those kinds of things, and we can bring succor closer to the people. We need food to go into some of the lockdown territory. How do we ensure that that happens? Organizing that flow. Government, private sector, civil society can work together to find seamless ways, if you can use seamless in this kind of context, to ensure that some of that is happening. And once the people perceive that the government is doing its best, even if they are taking pain, they will be able to deal. But when they think that, well, I mean, they don't care about us anyway, then you have a real social problem.
Right. Well, we're going to take a break shortly, Professor Utomi, but in effect, does that make the provision of a social net absolutely essential if this lockdown is going to work? Because otherwise, people are going to get out and hustle. Very briefly, because we're taking a break. Actually, perhaps I should ask you, because I don't want to have to interrupt you. Let me ask you to hold that. I'll repeat the question when we come back. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Professor Pat Utomi on the COVID-19 pandemic. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniegulu. Now, few Nigerians have tried so hard, so relentlessly, and so honestly to shape Nigeria for the better, and few of its activists have proved to be as inspirational and as galvanizing as Professor Pat Utomi, from tirelessly advocating to make Nigeria's political machinery work better, to protesting on the streets and in the corridors of power on behalf of the millions who've been abandoned. Dr. Utomi has become one of Nigeria's best-known fighters for social, political and economic justice and for the entrenchment of the rule of law. And now, in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, he's playing a key transformational role in educating both politicians and ordinary Nigerians about the curse of fake news and the world of misinformation and how dangerous it can be. We're also talking about a whole range of other issues relating to COVID-19. And Professor Pat Utomi is still with me from our Lagos studios. Thank you very much indeed for your abiding patience. And we were, just before we went on break, we're talking a little bit about the fact that of a social net to try and deal with this, the fact that it's absolutely essential to have that, or whether it is absolutely essential, because otherwise people are simply going to go out and hustle. So if you want the lockdown to work, there's got to be a social net.
Yes, very, very true. It is a major challenge with this whole initiative. I think government must realize that this is not business as usual. It must realize that the 2020 budget is out of the window. It must reprogram. It must send a new budget to the National Assembly, and it must cut away most of the things like the rebuilding of National Assembly or whatever it is they're doing, and get that money into providing a net for the citizens who are literally going to fall through. Now, another thing that is important that we should pay attention to is post-pandemic Nigeria. The world is not going to be the same again. There are many businesses that will not survive this shutdown. There are businesses that would need to completely change their structure. How will the system support these transitions that need to take place? And I think that the rework of the 2020 budget needs to pay attention to those things. We must cut out the highfalutin stuff and deal with survival issues, existential crises that citizens are facing, that businesses are going to be facing. We must have a facilitative body that is looking at how to make the new kinds of businesses that we need work, and work very quickly, so jobs can be provided in those sectors. But very critically, in this moment of truth, we need to put in some kind of social safety net. And I hear about all the donations, private sector people and all of that. It's got to be a think group. I hate the word tank at this point. A think group that can say, how do we best deploy what is available to keep people alive? I would not even as much want anybody to give cash to these people, but to give essential services. If it's food to be distributed to the most affected in some manner that it does not create a social stampede.
Right. Well, I mean,
I
don't mean to interrupt you, but we're kind of winding down towards the end of the program, and you've sort of preempted the question I was going to ask you next, because I was going to ask you to try and, you know, think of to help us try and think of a way out of this using your economic and civil society experience, which are both very considerable, as well as, of course, the fact that you are a former presidential advisor. I mean, what would work in Nigeria during this period and post this period? Large amounts of money spent by, you know, I don't know, by whom and spent on what? I mean, what's the best way to help Nigeria?
I have had people say, for example, well, the Americans giving $1,000 to every citizen or whatever, give X naira. In Nigeria, you don't have the capacity to even, we don't even know how many we are, we don't know who is where, we know most of our census is fraud. So how do you deal with that? You've got to look at where people live and look at interventions in those concentrations for now, not in any structured way of this for one person, but almost like you do a war relief effort. It's almost like, you know, Caritas landing aircraft in Biafra. And that is the kind of situation that we are in now. It must be dealt with as, you know, the way you intervene when there's a tsunami that has just hit the Indonesian coastline to deal with those people who are affected. That's the attitude. We are in a state of war. We long, you know, past the moral equivalence of war. We are in a state of war. And we must apply wartime deployment. And that's why I do not completely quarrel with the idea of soldiers being drafted, because we're in a state of war. But the soldiers have to approach this war different from the war that they fight, say, in the Northeast, or that they might be fighting elsewhere. But it is a state of war. So we have to identify people who are aware, keeping the best social distance possibilities, ensuring they get the basics to survive this season. Then after this season, we can rework our whole budget, even if it means shutting the National Assembly for the rest of the year. I don't think they're making laws that are so important that we can't shut them down for the rest of the year.
Okay,
while
Professor
we run our
Pat
country.
Utomi, very, very interesting talking with you. Professor Pat Utomi is an academic, former presidential advisor, and anti-corruption champion and voice of the civil society coalition against COVID-19 misinformation. And he was talking to me there from our studios in Lagos. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Lagos. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.